Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're checking out AMD's new Ryzen 7 8700G, and they claim it to have the most powerful integrated graphics in a desktop CPU. So, can this new APU take on your graphics card? Probably not, but before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new 12th gen CPU contact frame by Baldur. It's well known that the integrated loading mechanism, or ILM, of the LJ1700 sockets bends 12th gen CPUs, leading to an uneven contact surface that reduces cooling performance. Solving this issue, the contact frame replaces the ILM, allowing for a much more even contact with the CPU's IHS and the base of your cooler, which in turn reduces operating temperatures. Installation's quick and easy, and thanks to the use of anodized aluminium, the contact frame is non-conductive. And then, for those of you who wish to further maximize contact, Thermal Grizzly now offers an optional lapping tool, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so the new Ryzen 8000G series of processors includes a Radeon 700M series GPU based on the Radeon RX architecture, using up to 12 compute units. And AMD says these iGPUs will be powerful enough to play pretty much any PC game at 1080p. In total, there are 4 Ryzen 8000G series products that have been announced so far, and while we'll be looking at the 8700G today, I also have the Ryzen 5 8600G, and we'll take a look at that model in the coming days. Now, the 8700G packs 8 cores with 16 threads. It is built using a 4nm process, and the cores are based on the Zen 4 architecture, but because this is a monolithic design that also has to incorporate a reasonably large GPU, stuff like cache capacity has been reduced when compared to the standard Ryzen 7000 series processors. For example, the 8700G packs a 16MB L3 cache with 8MB of L2, whereas the Ryzen 7 7700 is armed with a much larger 32MB L3 cache, though the L2 capacity is the same at 8MB. Now, whereas the 7700 packs an RDNA 2 GPU with just 2 CUs and a boost clock of 2.2 GHz, the 8700G is armed with the Radeon 780M, and that's a 12CU RDNA 3 GPU that clocks as high as 2.9 GHz, so you can expect a lot more from this iGPU. However, whereas the 7700 packs 28 lanes of PCIe 5.0, 4 of which are reserved for connecting to the chipset, the 8700G packs just 20 lanes in total, and they're of the PCIe 4.0 variety. And this means there are a maximum of 8 PCIe 4.0 lanes for the primary PCIe slot, so the graphics card, whereas the 7700 has 16 PCIe 5.0 lanes for the graphics card. Then lastly, the 8700G includes Ryzen AI, the world's first dedicated AI engine on a desktop processor. Using AMD's XDNA architecture clocked at 1.6 GHz, this is a dedicated AI engine that's separate to the CPU and GPU cores that we've just looked at. You could call it an NPU, a neural processing unit. How useful you'll find this feature at this point in time is hard to say, and with gaming being our primary focus here at Hardware Unboxed, we won't be getting into the AI benchmarks just yet. Moreover, anyone who is actually interested in AI on a desktop computer would surely purchase a discrete GPU, as they're much more powerful for AI workloads. Now, for testing, we've used the ASUS ROG Strix B650A gaming Wi-Fi motherboard with Beta BIOS 2263. Then for the memory, we've gone with a 32GB DDR5 6400 Cell32 kit from G-Skill. It's their Trident Z5 Neo memory, and the FCLK has been manually set to 2400 MHz, as there is an issue with the latest Beta BIOS not setting this parameter correctly automatically. But this will be fixed for the public release. Okay, let's see what the 8700G can do. We'll start with some basic application benchmarks, and first up is Cinebench with the single core test. Here the 8700G scores 111 points, making it 21% faster than the 5700G and just 5% slower than the 7700, though it was 15% slower than the 14700K. Then when measuring multi-core performance, we find that the 8700G is comparable to that of the 7700, which makes sense. They're both 8-core 16-thread Zen 4 processors, and stuff like cache capacity and memory performance only plays a very small role for this test. Then when compared to the older 5700G, it's 37% faster, and then a massive 44% increase over the Core i3 12100F, which will prove to be a more relevant comparison as we work our way through the gaming benchmarks. Next, we have 7-zip file manager compression, and here the 8700G is 40% faster than the 5700G and just 13% slower than the Ryzen 7 7700. Then for decompression, it's just 8% faster than the 5700G and 12% slower than the 7700. When it comes to Photoshop performance, we're looking at a 34% improvement over the 5700G, so a pretty big uplift there. Meanwhile, the 8700G was just 6% slower than the 7700. Now, it's worth noting that the 12100F doesn't have an iGPU, so for these application benchmarks, it's been paired with the Radeon RX 6600. And fun fact, the Core i3 plus Radeon GPU combo costs slightly less than that of the 8700G. And that's an issue for AMD's new APU in Premiere, as this application uses GPU acceleration, and as a result, the more affordable Core i3 plus RX 6600 combo is 86% faster. Okay, time to look at gaming performance, and of course we're starting with the integrated graphics results, because this is potentially what makes the 8700G special. For all of this testing, we're focusing on 1080p low quality gaming, because, well, this is integrated graphics after all. And first up is Baldur's Gate 3, and the 8700G was good for 49 FPS on average, which is impressive compared to the likes of the 5700G, and then standard processors such as the Core i7 14700K and Ryzen 7 7700. When compared to AMD's previous 8-core APU, the 8700G is 145% faster. That's obviously a very big performance uplift, but more than that, it's the difference between being unplayable and playable. Next up, we have Counter-Strike 2, which is possible to play using an iGPU. The 5700G, for example, is good for 61 FPS on average, though the 1% lows aren't great. The 8700G, though, is 95% faster when comparing the average frame rate, and with 119 FPS on average, the game is very playable, maybe not competitively, but still, it is playable. And it's a similar story with Fortnite. When compared to the 5700G, the 8700G is offering 78% more performance, averaging an impressive 132 FPS. The game ran surprisingly well. Again, this isn't really good enough for competitive gamers, but for those playing more casually, it will work well. As you'd expect, more demanding games such as Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, they're a bit of a stretch, but with 41 FPS on average and 1% lows of 30 FPS, the game is certainly playable, and that's a lot more than you can say for parts like the 5700G. F1 2023 ran really well with the 8700G, pumping at 125 FPS on average. That's a massive improvement from the 5700G. In fact, it's a 123% uplift. It's also a world of difference when compared to the 14700K and 7700. We're seeing the same thing in Spider-Man Remastered. The 8700G is able to deliver a smooth, playable experience with 68 FPS on average, making it more than twice as fast as the 5700G, which rendered just 32 FPS on average. Like Cyberpunk 2077, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is a bit much even for the 8700G. Well, at least for 60 FPS gaming. For those of you happy with 30 FPS, it works, and I guess that's more than you can say for the 5700G and really anything slower, which is basically everything else. Finally, we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and here the 8700G can pump out over 60 FPS, averaging 74 FPS, and that's an incredible improvement over the 5700G, rendering 3 times more frames, and more crucially, allowing gamers to actually play the game using an iGPU. Now, before we move on to some discrete GPU benchmarks, let's take a quick look at memory scaling performance. For testing, we use DDR5 6400 memory at a 1:1 ratio using a 2400 MHz FCLK, but this isn't necessarily the most optimal configuration, though AMD does claim that all CPUs will be capable of achieving this specification. That said, AMD also notes that most CPUs will achieve DDR5 7200 using a 1:2 ratio, and this can be beneficial. And that's because memory bandwidth is crucial when it comes to iGPU performance, so the rules here are a bit different to that of the Ryzen 7000 series, where you typically prioritize latency. Also, because the 8000 series APUs use a monolithic die, they will default to a higher clocked FCLK. And this is because we're moving away from the chiplet approach. There's no need for a GMI, or Global Memory Interconnect. So whereas the 7000 series will try and default to 2000 MHz, The 8000 series APUs will try and default to 2400 MHz. So with all of that in mind, we're going to run a few different memory configurations, including a 1 to 2 configuration using DDR5 7200. Starting with Fortnite, we find when using DDR5 7200 memory, that boosts performance by a further 4%. Not exactly earth-shattering, but it is extra performance. It's also worth noting that the official memory spec for the 8700G is actually DDR5 5200, and using 5200 spec memory saw performance decline by 15%. Moving on to F1 2023, we find that this title is less memory sensitive, only gaining an additional 2% performance when using DDR5 7200, or losing 8% with DDR5 5200. And then we have Spider-Man Remastered, which shows us that DDR5 7200 isn't always going to be faster, as in this example performance did decline, dropping a frame when compared to the 6400 configuration. We also saw a rather large 22% reduction in performance when using the official 5200 memory spec. Okay, so we've just seen how the 8700G and its integrated graphics compare to other processors with iGPUs, but how does it compare to a really bad discrete graphics card, like the steaming pile that is the 6500 XT? Well, we're about to find out, and keep in mind the 6500 XT currently costs $140 US. The 8700G is comparable to the 6500 XT using PCIe 3.0 with something like the 5700G in Baldur's Gate 3. It's quite incredible just how poorly the 6500 XT performs with the 5700G in this title, using the low quality preset at 1080p. But if you pair the 6500 XT with a PCIe 4.0 enabled system, it is around 45% faster. In fact, we see that when pairing it with the 8700G. That said, it's around 70% faster when paired with the Ryzen 7 7700, simply because that is a faster processor, so that's less than ideal for the 8700G. The Counter-Strike 2 results are also quite brutal, as here the 5700G, armed with the 6500 XT, is more than twice as fast as the 8700G's integrated graphics, and that's bad because the 5700G plus the 6500 XT costs less than just the 8700G. And we'll talk more about that a bit later on. Testing in Fortnite shows the 6500 XT to be at least 58% faster than the 8700G, and up to 74% faster when paired with something like the Ryzen 7 7700 or Core i7 14700K. And remember, the 6500 XT is a really, really bad graphics card. I can't stress that enough, it is awful. The Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty results are quite shocking as they highlight just how bad the 6500 XT is, if I haven't already done that myself. Using PCI Express 3.0 with the 5700G, we're looking at 33 FPS on average, making the discrete GPU slower than the iGPU of the 8700G. Then if we enable PCIe 4.0, the 6500 XT is able to edge out the 8700G's iGPU, so weak performance all around really. We're seeing a similar thing in F1 2023. The iGPU of the 8700G is able to beat the 6500 XT when you limit the Radeon GPU to PCIe 3.0 with something like a 5700G. But when paired with the Core i3 at 12100F, it's a mere 8% faster, though we are a bit CPU limited here as the Ryzen 7 7700 is showing up to a 34% increase. The Spider-Man Remastered results are interesting. Again, we see that PCI Express 3.0 cripples the 6500 XT, limiting it to just 46 FPS on average when paired with the 5700G. Then interestingly, the 8700G delivered the same performance using either its iGPU or the 6500 XT. In fact, performance was slightly better with the iGPU. And in fact, it wasn't until we paired the 6500 XT with a high-end desktop CPU that it was able to pull ahead of the 8700's iGPU. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart also saw the 6500 XT fall in a heap when using PCIe 3.0, rendering just 30 FPS on average with the 5700G. Even when using PCIe 4.0, it was only slightly faster than the 8700G's iGPU. Finally, for the last of the 6500 XT results, I promise this is all the 6500 XT testing we're going to be looking at, we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and here the 8700G is able to match the 6500 XT when paired with most processors. The 14700K results don't really make sense here, as it shouldn't be that much faster than the Ryzen 7 7700, so I suspect this is one of those resizable bar issues that we occasionally come across, but that would require further investigation to confirm, and really it's not important for this content, despite being quite interesting. Okay, enough messing around. Now it's time to see what you can do for around $330 US, so the price of an 8700G. For example, you could buy something like a Core i3 12100F, they're about $100, and then pair that with a $200 Radeon RX 6600, and doing so, will that provide you with a better gaming experience? Well, let's go find out. For testing, I've included a few GPU configurations, one of which features the 7900 XTX to see just how fast these CPUs really are. As you can see, when maxed out, the 8700G is 17% faster than the 12100F, or 35% faster when comparing 1% lows. So technically it is the better gaming CPU, but really no shocker there, it should be, it costs 3 times more. But the problem for the 8700G, and the reason why it ultimately makes no sense for gaming, is this. The Core i3 12100F paired with a Radeon RX 6600, a combo that's 127% faster in Baldur's Gate 3, and this is certainly a best case scenario for the APU. If we were to turn up the quality settings, the RX 6600 would still render over 60 FPS, while the 8700G would essentially be choked to death. Next up we have Counter-Strike 2, and using the 7900 XTX, we see that the 8700G is 30% more powerful than the Core i3 in this title. But if we compare $300 combinations, we see that the Core i3 12100F/RX 6600 combo is 113% faster, and fast enough for competitive gameplay. We're looking at much the same in Fortnite. Again, the 8700G is 30% faster than the Core i3 when paired with the 7900 XTX, but if we compare its iGPU performance to the RX 6600 combo, we find the Core i3 is an eye-watering 182% faster, rendering 372 FPS compared to 132 FPS. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty is a more GPU-limited title when compared to, say, Fortnite and Counter-Strike, even when using the low-quality preset, and as a result, the 8700G was 19% faster than the Core i3 when pairing both processors with the 7900 XTX. But if we compare the $300 combos, so the Core i3 with the Radeon GPU, it's offering 124% more performance, rendering 92 FPS on average, opposed to just 41 FPS. The Core i3 12100F performs very well in F1 2023, allowing for 333 FPS to be rendered when using the 7900 XTX, making the 8700G a mere 7% faster. Then once again we find that the Core i3 plus RX 6600 slaughters the 8700G and its iGPU, providing an additional 154% performance. With ray tracing disabled, Spider-Man Remastered, it's not a very CPU-demanding game, and as a result, the Core i3 12100F is able to match the 8700G when paired with a high-end GPU, such as the 7900 XTX. Then, when compared to the Core i3 with the RX 6600, we find that it's 113% faster than the 8700G and its iGPU, and the Core i3 combo actually costs a bit less. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart also isn't a very CPU-demanding game, so the Core i3 is able to match the 8700G when armed with a high-end GPU. Then once again we find that for those of you who have around $300 to spend on your CPU and GPU combo, the 8700G simply doesn't make sense, as the Core i3/RX 6600 combo is 141% faster, and with 94 FPS on average, enables a significantly more enjoyable gaming experience. Finally, we have the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 results, and in this example, the 8700G is 56% faster than the 12100F when paired with the 7900 XTX. But if we compare the $300 budget combos, the Core i3 still wins, delivering more than twice as much performance with 154 FPS on average. So in short, if you're spending $330 on your CPU for gaming, the 8700G, it's just not a good option. The Ryzen 7 7700 was on average 26% faster in our testing when using the 7900 XTX. Admittedly, we are using low quality settings for continuity across a range of the tests done for this video, but even with ultra settings using stuff like ray tracing, the larger L3 cache buffer of the 7700 will see it deliver better gaming performance. Finally, here's a quick look at power consumption. At idle, the 8700G system consumed 41 watts. Then under a single core load, total system draw hit 79 watts, and for an all-core workload, it went as high as 131 watts. As for gaming, in Spider-Man, we saw a total system load of 148 watts, so needless to say, this is a very low-powered combo. So there you have it, AMD's new Ryzen 7 8700G, and I've got to admit, I'm still not entirely sure who the world's most powerful integrated graphics desktop processor thing is for, or at least who this makes sense for. It's not exactly cheap at $330 US, and at that price, it's not the best value combination of CPU and GPU hardware. I mean, sure, it isn't a single package. What the 8700G delivers as an all-in-one solution is certainly impressive, but unless for some reason you require your desktop CPU and GPU integrated into a single solution, it just doesn't make sense. For ultra mini PCs, this processor will certainly enable next level performance, but beyond that extremely niche use case, I don't really get it. This certainly isn't a mainstream part, simply because there are better alternatives. For example, if you're after strong CPU performance for gaming, the 7800X 3D will be much faster for a small $70 premium, or as we saw when using the 1700 XTX, the Ryzen 7 7700 is significantly faster for the same price. So what sort of use case does the 8700G make sense for? If it's just general computing, then the 8700G is overkill in my opinion, and if it's gaming, well, as we've just discovered, there are significantly better hardware combinations for the same price, or even less, such as the Core i3-12100F and Radeon RX 6600, which regularly delivered well over twice as much gaming performance. The Core i3-12100F combo was better for video production work as well, given how heavily GPU accelerated those workloads are now. So while the 8700G is certainly a technically impressive product, at $330 US, it's not going to make sense for the vast majority of consumers. And of course, our focus is on gaming, and I can confidently say without a shadow of a doubt that the 8700G is not a good investment for gaming. But for those of you who want to jump on the AM5 platform, just get yourself a Ryzen 5 7600 for $230 US and pair that with a Radeon RX 6600 or something better for a starting price of $430 US. Your experience there is going to be worlds better. It's a 30% premium for what will typically be over 150% greater performance. And there's not much more to say really. The idea of a gaming APU for budget users, it always sounds great, but in practice they're just never fast enough, and cheaper discrete combos always deliver significantly better performance. And I really don't expect this will change anytime soon. And that is going to do it for this one. If you like the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content. We will have a look at the 8600G, the Ryzen 5 model, and see how that goes. And yeah, see what other models we can get our hands on. But yeah, I think as you go down the stack, the iGPU becomes less powerful. So although they become cheaper, they're not as good as what we see here. Anyway, as I said, we'll explore that in future content. So make sure you are subscribed if you're interested in more APU action, and of course, just all the other content we do here at Hardware Unboxed. Also, we have Floatplane Patreon. Sign up to either one of those things. We'll give you access to some cool perks. We have a monthly live stream, Discord server, behind the scenes content, Q&A stuff, a lot of cool things there. Check it out if you're interested. But if not, it's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.